that's neither here nor there. Let me actually get to the serious part.
Yes.
So yeah, I just, like any good journalist, threw together a presentation to guide my thoughts. And by that, I mean last minute, I kind of threw this together. So it's nothing fancy. And you don't have to look at my face the whole time this way. So
hold on, but you forgot to note that, like any good journalist, you did it while in bed.
oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, I didn't leave my bed. Working from home in the remote era is an incredible thing.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm Steven. My critics would describe me as a fake journalist, or a far left propagandist, but I've written for all the places that are here. I'm not going to read them all to you. And my focus is extremism, disinformation, and corruption broadly. I write about some other things sometimes, as I see fit, because I'm a freelancer. And so no one can necessarily tell me no. It's just my job to get them to tell me yes. And I also publish a literary magazine, which I founded before I started working as a journalist full time. So that's a photo of me on the first assignment I was ever on for a newspaper. I got arrested. And so, like, that was during the George Floyd protests in Dallas. And my reporting during that time actually led to several police officers, not, only my reporting, but it contributed to, the evidence base that resulted in 2 police officers getting indicted for police brutality. And so I thought after I got arrested and hit with tear gas and stuff, maybe I can keep doing it. And that was in 2020. So what are we talking about today? This is just the brief overview. And I'm going to try to keep it kind of light, because I'm not a professor or an academic. So we're just going to talk a little bit about investigative journalism from my perspective. What the heck is it? Sort of what do I look to in terms of its historical origins, the idea of the muckrakers, some modern examples, and I have some links to some of my personal experiences, which I can touch on. And then I'm also going to talk about social media. I believe you already learned about the doctor of journalism, Mr. Hunter S. Thompson. And so I'm going to talk about, the dual-edged sword relationship with social media. As Brandi said, yeah, I've got like lots of Twitter followers, but that's also hell. And so lastly, I'll just kind of talk a little bit about what it's like having been a freelancer, some tips about that, independent publishing, and then we can do some question and answer stuff, so you don't have to listen to me talk the whole time. Cool. So yeah, what the heck is investigative journalism? This is from Zodiac. So yeah, in my brief definition, it's uncovering bad shit few people know about. You're not a cop, you're not a private investigator, but you're investigating things that are sort of uncovered, or yet to be uncovered, I should say. Things that are of public significance. Maybe they've been buried intentionally, or perhaps accidentally by error, or just by the passage of time. It can take months and years in some cases to write really long exposés. If you're talking about series and books, it can also be a solid 2,000-word article. The work tends to be long form, so I understand it's relevant to this course. In terms of like the original investigative journalists, the muckrakers, there's a few people. There's one person here who's kind of considered the forerunner, one of perhaps the original muckrakers, and he was active in the late 1800s. Chambers is his last name. Then there's an example here of a book by Upton Sinclair, another landmark muckraker, and McClure's magazine, which to this day is referenced in terms of its impact on the standards and sort of approaches that investigative journalists use. It was a place that a lot of muckrakers were published in at the time. And some textbooks still reference things that came out of that establishment. So in terms of the historical origins and when they came about, it's like kind of the same as it ever was, right? Some of the stuff might sound familiar. newspapers during the late 1800s and 1900 and the early 1900s were sensationalist. They were biased, controlled by large corporate magnates. This was a time of, intense inequality, a time of monopolies like Standard Oil in the railroad system, really, really rich people and really, really poor people, and during the Industrial Revolution era. So the muckrakers kind of emerged during a tumultuous time. There was a lot of what was known as yellow journalism at the time, which was sensationalist, but not necessarily for the purpose of change. Whereas muckrakers like Upton Sinclair, who's an open socialist and activist, they were reform-minded and politically active. Not all of them even were necessarily professional journalists like in Sinclair, but they used journalism to try to affect social change, and were adept at the tools and approaches that investigative journalists use today. Like I mentioned, they are published in magazines like McClure's, or often in book form. Sometimes it would be serialized and then put in a book form, which is still common today in some ways. Some landmark examples, as I mentioned, Chambers. Julius Chambers worked for the New York Tribune. He's like a forerunner to the muckrakers before they really sort of established themselves as a movement, an explicit group of people. And he wrote about the conditions in asylums in the late 1800s. And his work resulted in some, he contributed to change in laws. And that's another thing that I didn't mention in the definition, but I would say is a quality or characteristic of good investigative journalism, is that it can have an impact. There's a difference between reporting on a sports team and just saying what happened, and say, uncovering some sort of scandal inside the management of a sports team, which could impact the leadership or the way that it's run. And investigative journalism tends to try to do the latter when it's good. Other examples, Southern Horrors by I.D.B. Wells, really important series of articles about Jim Crow, lynch laws, the brutality of that era. As I mentioned, Standard Oil, another leading muckraker female writer, Ida Tarbell, wrote 2 books about the Rockefellers, Standard Oil, and their abuse of financial trusts and other sort of tactics to grow and maintain their dominance over the industry. And that work contributed to antitrust laws that changed the way things work. And so I mentioned Upton Sinclair, The Jungle. It was about the meatpacking industry, also changed to the overhauling of regulations in that industry. So the current state of sort of muckraking and investigative journalism, it's not to say that it doesn't exist anymore. There's still lots of good work that can come out of a lot of newspapers. But the rise of the internet and social media has basically decimated the way that those sorts of investigations were funded. So now we're still dealing with the consequences of that big shift. And not unlike the early 1900s, you need to kind of look to other places increasingly for investigative journalism on certain issues. Places like ProPublica still set the bar in terms of high quality investigative journalism, but they're a nonprofit, and sort of have to partner with other places to make sure their distribution is wide enough to reach the audiences that they need to reach in order to help affect change. I mentioned some others at the bottom here that I think are just a handful of really good places that put out groundbreaking work that I look to on a pretty regular basis in terms of just cutting edge investigative journalism. And I'm not going to get into all the details in all of these, but these are just, a handful of some pretty landmark examples of investigative sort of muckraking in the modern era, the big level. You may have heard of some of these. You may have not heard of all of them. But these were, major efforts, often involving multiple journalists, covering, really significant issues of the time. The Pentagon Papers being about the Vietnam War and why we went into it, and the the truth around our involvement, Watergate being about Nixon, The Color of Money being about redlining and sort of discrimination in mortgages in Atlanta, the NSA obviously being about surveillance, and the Panama and the Paradise Papers being about sort of this, international financial network that allows, rich and powerful people and also criminals and gangs and mafias to move and hide their money in unsettling ways. So if you don't know about these, I would recommend looking into them because they are truly significant pieces of journalism. And then here's just some headlines of some stuff that I wrote. I'm not going to click into all of these, but these were ones that I think were pretty significant in terms of my ability to uncover something that hadn't been reported on, was sort of undercovered and ended up resulting in some change, either in one case a grand jury and an indictment for a candidate, in another case people actually getting paid money after they didn't have power for several days whenever they originally weren't going to get paid, to the anti-abortion bounty website being basically taken down. These are all things that I would consider impactful and wins, even if they weren't, years-long efforts like some of the other landmark examples that I've described. I'm going to pause because I've been talking a lot before I just dive into the next thing. Does anybody have any sort of questions or thoughts before I move into the next section?
So I know you said that you covered the George Floyd, instances. This might sound stupid, but does going to jail help the investigative part?
So I was fortunate in that they actually didn't take me to jail. They put me in handcuffs, or rather the plastic binders, and then they ended up releasing me once they were sufficiently convinced that I was actually a journalist. I would say it gave me a very interesting story, and it has also led to me being represented by some really good lawyers in a lawsuit against the city of Dallas for that treatment, which is still playing out, and I can't really necessarily comment on exactly how it's going to go, but it is something that at least tested my sort of commitment, I suppose, and didn't scare me off. So was at least a signifier for me that I could do the job, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, if that makes sense.
Is that the only time you've been arrested, though? I feel
Yeah.
like the cops are always they're always surrounding you whenever you're out and about, and you're always getting abused by someone. So
I try to be a good boy.
yeah, okay. I believe that for a moment. Does anybody else have any questions at the moment? No, we're good. Next slide.
Cool. So that's Hunter S. Thompson. Just, this is I like this image. It's very haunting and ominous for some reason. And his whole fear and loathing thing about politics. I feel that way about social media. And in terms of being a journalist, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. It's designed to make you have this sense of the fear of missing out, but you don't actually have to worry about that too much because you're probably going to have to use it anyway. If you don't use it, you're losing out on something. You're kind of screwed and fucked. But if you do use it, you're screwed and fucked in a different way. So before I was a journalist, I worked at Google for 4 years. And I left that job for a number of reasons that, we're not going to get into. This isn't a therapy session. But one of the things that I took away from it is that, this sort of algorithmic social media stuff, which I would also include YouTube in that, it can be pretty poisonous for people. They can go down these rabbit holes and, get hooked on some really wacky, potentially extreme bad stuff like conspiracy theories. And while, Twitter isn't guaranteed to make you that way, it can also, encourage bad habits or, bring out the worst in people. Like it's also good sometimes. Like all my friends live in my phone. I started journalism seriously during the pandemic. So that's how I, got to know your professor. It can be a great networking tool. I've got lots of followers. Cool. I've got an audience that I can put things out to, and it can help me in my freelancing career. But, a lot of people can say stupid stuff in the heat of the moment, and those things are forever. And you see on a monthly basis, somebody puts their foot in their mouth at the, risk of their own career. So, don't get brain poisoned. Just don't screw it up. Like, if you're going to use social media and in any of these things, whether it's TikTok or Twitter or Instagram, as a journalist, it can be powerful, but just, be cautious when you use it. Don't you are the product. That's why it's free. So, your data and your behavior is what they're selling. Don't be afraid to develop a voice as a journalist. That can be good for you. You can make jokes if you're funny. But just know that the more you do that, the more risk there is that you might say something that causes, you to be the main character of the internet for the day. And that's usually not a welcomed position. And then, just think before you post stuff, and talk to your friends ahead of time and be like, should I say this? If you really want to say something and you're having your doubts. And just remember, your feelings are temporary, but archived posts of your, things that you said on the internet are forever. And all the internet points are fake, and none of it matters. So just don't take it too seriously, and you can make it a beneficial tool. It's worked for me as an independent freelancer. But there can be also trade-offs. And, if you are a staff reporter or something, they probably will expect you to behave a little more circumspect. So, I bring up the history of the original muckrakers to point out that also a lot of them weren't necessarily shy about things that they thought were wrong. And so, that's something that sometimes journalists can get in trouble with if they post things like that on the internet. So, these are complicated issues, and it's just me trying to encourage you to think deeply about them, because it can seem like it's all fun and games, and then, your career can implode because some troll decides to pump it out to their 1 million followers that you said something a little silly. So I'm too lazy to make this slide. And hold on, I'm just going to stop screen sharing. In terms of freelancing, I mean, it's tough. It helps if you have connections and experiences and editors that you already have relationships with. So, if you're a student in journalism school, you're already going to have a leg up in that regard, in terms of being able to, know cool people like Brandi, who can introduce you to people and help you just, get an introduction email. Because the way that I got my first freelance gig was someone messaged me and said, hey, why don't you just send an email to the Dallas Voice and offer to cover the protests for them? And I said, that's a pretty cool idea. Why not? I'm probably going to go check that stuff out anyway. And I shot them an email, and they said, hey, sure, we've seen you've written some stuff before, go for it. Like, we'll pay you this much. And then the rest just kind of was momentum in history. So, don't be afraid of emailing people. They are looking for pitches. Editors want to hear from you. Knowing how to make a good pitch is a big part of it. So I will gladly, as Brandi requested, share a pitch of mine that's been successful. And as a freelancer, it can be a little more challenging, because you kind of have to have something good in order for, a big outlet to want to run with it. Because they could just have one of their staff reporters put out something a little quickly. It doesn't have to be super deep if it's already a sort of known story. So you kind of have to do some of the reporting already ahead of time in order to have a good pitch. And that can vary depending on the sort of relationships that you have with editors from publication to publication, whether it's a magazine versus sort of a daily news site. There's a lot of factors. that can play into it. If you're juggling multiple clients and you're working at multiple outlets, they may have different sort of editorial voices that you need to adapt to. And knowing what those are, even before you pitch, is a really good idea. You should know what style they like and what's expected of the writers, so that you don't waste a ton of your precious time as a freelancer doing back and forth edits. Because when they ask you to do back and forth edits, they don't pay you extra money for that time. It's either you finish it or you don't. So lots of challenges, but it can also be rewarding in that you can write for a lot of different places and get access to audiences that you may not have otherwise been able to get your work in front of, as long as you can sort of sustain it and juggle it. You kind of have to be your own salesman, your own boss, and your own manager. All of those things in one, because no one's submitting the invoices on your behalf. No one's doing payroll on your behalf, all that sort of stuff. And learning how to do the job on top of all of that is difficult when you don't have someone who's like mentoring you and all of that. So you really need to also look out for yourself in finding mentors, people who can give you solid advice, impartial advice about difficult decisions or, sort of career goals and how you're doing and dealing with things. That was something that I had to find for myself, which, COVID made challenging, but also things like Twitter made it somewhat easy sometimes to network with people and meet new editors. So just don't be afraid to put yourself out there. And then in terms of the independent publishing thing, let's see. I won't spend a ton of time on this because this is less journalism. We do some sort of journalistic work, but the magazine I publish is this. It's actually print, and there's good long form stuff in here. And so this was an interesting journey for us to just figure out how to start this on our own and, create a new thing and find the sort of cool long form writing we wanted, as well as poetry and art and stuff. And it's challenging. Don't do it. It's a stupid idea. That's my advice on that. But if you want to do it, it seems something that's interesting to you, I'm always happy to talk about it at a later time. It's fun, but you don't hear a lot about literary magazines a lot these days. And so for me, it's definitely a passion project. Cool. So I'm going to stop. And if you guys have questions, I'm happy to address those. Otherwise, I can always just talk about other stuff at length, rambling for hours, if that's what you're here for.
Yeah,
which
you
I've
gotta
seen.
talk till 12:20.
Say that again.
You gotta talk till 12:20. No,
Talk
I'm
till
just.
Oh, I can do that. I can
No,
do
no,
that.
I'm just kidding. I'm
I was
kidding.
like, have you listened to a podcast I'm on? They have to kick me out.
I know, but I see you tweet, so. I'm gonna call on my students to ask questions, because I always know that they need to ask guest lectures questions. So, Ariana has
Yeah.
asked a question, but I'm
I'm
sure
going to be
Ariana-
disappointed if you guys don't ask tough questions to an investigative journalist.
I have another one. Malone has a question.
How do you go about deciding on what you're going to investigate? There's 1,000 things and you have your different passions and as far as local things going on. So what does that discernment process look like for you?
That's a great question. So that gives me an opportunity to talk really about the actual work, because I talked a lot about what is it and where did it start and what are some examples, but the actual work can be a little mysterious if you don't know what it is. So for me, I have picked a focus area for a few reasons. I mentioned it earlier: extremism, disinformation, and like sort of corruption, broadly speaking, which can be political or within a corporation. And I have focused on those things because I see a lot of things that I find fitting under that umbrella around me that aren't really getting written about. So it's sort of a void, so to speak, that I don't know why it's there. And I think that's in a big way why I've been able to gain traction so quickly, because I've focused on things that I think people do care about and they want to hear about, but for whatever reason are just getting missed. And so that's a thing that a good investigative journalist will build an instinct about, is sort of like what isn't being talked about, what isn't being told. And how, so, you know, your question specifically, how do you find those things? Like, what does that actually look like? Well, having a big social media following can be beneficial in that regard, because it means a lot of people know who I am and know that they might want to come to me with tips and leaks and things like that. So many like major investigative reports started out with a source who was an insider coming to some journalist and saying, you will not believe the shit that I'm about to show you. And so that's half of the battle, is being sort of known as a person who can be trusted, someone who will look deeply into things and will tell the story. And so building a reputation for that, that's a whole other thing. That's just about doing good work and being consistent over time. But in terms of, you know, picking up on those scoops, yeah, building up a stable, so to speak, of sources, a network of people who trust you is key. Figuring out what that sort of area of focus you want to dig into and figure out where are those voids that people aren't looking at, which takes some time. But I would encourage you to try to find something that you're interested in so that you don't mind spending as much time looking into it. That helps. And then, yeah, building that expertise so that as things develop, you can kind of, yeah, you can read the tea leaves, so to speak, or look in the forest floor and find the tracks. And then it's a challenge of knowing where to look next. And so a good investigative journalist builds over time a lot of skills around research, which includes knowing about what database even exist, how to navigate them, how to associate those databases with perhaps other information, you know, knowing strategically how to request things from public information officers at various, you know, points of government, being able to collect your own data, so to speak, knowing where to go, and then, you know, kind of also the challenge of documenting this stuff over time, so that if you're undertaking like a 6-month investigative process, which might be somewhat speculative and spread out, that as you add on to it, it sort of builds and builds, so that you're not having to do a bunch of rework whenever you have that aha moment that ties everything together. And so, you know, to really wrap that up and give you a concise answer, it's about source building, learning research techniques, which can be technical sometimes, and knowing how to talk to people so that they give you more information so you can piece it all together, and making sure that you can document all that information carefully, so that it's easy to tie together whenever you finally get what you need in terms of that missing puzzle piece. Because for any big story, that's kind of, you know, it's often a thing that'll happen where you'll be working around the edges of something, you'll be almost there, and then finally you get, you know, the smoking gun, and then the rest is just writing and editing. So I hope that answers your question, and if it doesn't, I'm happy to try to answer it again.
Yes, no, that was perfect. Thank you very much.
Stephen is also very good, not only about producing long-form journalism published for digital sites, but excuse me, he does it really well through social media as well. So I was telling you all the other day about how I want to add producing long form journalism through social media. Well, so you can go look at his Twitter right now, and he'll have threads of 200, tweets covering, really focusing on the stuff that he's covering. And yes, as he noted, he has done plenty of sourcing. He just got pushed by some guy the other day. He's been covering JFK's return as Donald Trump or whatever, those rallies.
Yeah, there's a lot of wild stuff going on in the Dallas area that I also could show you guys some examples of some other more like data oriented aspects of my work, which I think actually could be useful and would help fill up some of this time, because when people think of journalism, they often think of just like long form words on a page. But as Brandi said, social media, I try to do two sort of long form things on Twitter. One, which will be like, here's something that you should all just know. And I'm kind of too lazy to write an article about it, but here's 14 tweets that pull together a bunch of evidence that illustrate what I'm trying to talk to you. The other thing is, if I'm at a major event or something, everybody's familiar with live tweeting probably, but people seem to enjoy the sort of immersive reporting on some of these colorful events, very much so. And I think it helps give people a richer picture of what life is actually like, because sometimes I'll go to an event and then I'll see like the Dallas Morning News put out a report on it, which will be like accurate. There won't be anything factually wrong with it, but it won't give you the vibe. It won't give you a sense of what it was like to be there at all. So that's something that I think social media can help with a lot. And you can then sort of use some of those things that you report on live later on in a deeper investigation or in a deeper report, which, I personally think is totally fine if it's stuff that you've written, as long as you're citing that, you originally posted it somewhere else. That's within ethics and boundaries.
I also want to note that during the winter storm, the Daily Beast had reached out to me, but I was like, no, Steven's like right in the middle of it. So I passed his contact information along. But it was so funny because he's going, we're supposed to do the electric grid failed at DFW. Y'all are up here, right? He was going to the rich parts of town and like showing all the like churches that were using electricity when they should have been saving it, and like showing houses like mansions like using electricity. Like he was calling everybody out in Highland Park, and it was just amazing.
They did not enjoy that at all. And we still have had like a very bad analysis of the sort of aftermath of why some of that stuff happened, even to begin with. Very frustrating. So this here, I'm going to share my screen again. I think you might find this interesting. I don't know if you'll be able to read it incredibly well, but I will do my best to navigate through this so that it's like somewhat clear. So this is just called a network map. You may have seen something like this before. And this is a description here. I actually published this as a part of an article. So the article itself was pretty long, and it had I snuck in a good meme as the header. But what it was really about is this organization in Dallas called the Friends of the Dallas Police, which is a nonprofit fundraising organization that basically gives awards to the police. And I did this during 2020 after the protests, and I found some really interesting things. And this is a sort of tool that an investigative journalist can use if they're looking at, like political fundraising, for example, or political distributions and contributions in the political arena. This can be used for looking into sort of business connections between organizations, and also demonstrating relationships between people. And so what this tries to illustrate is a few things, some basic things, right? Like here are all of the board leaders, and it filters and it makes it visible. to you exactly who they are, but then you can learn more about them in an interactive way. So, for example, the president of the Friends of the Dallas Police is subject to an SEC lawsuit alleged regarding fraudulent investment practices. And then he was also in a lawsuit where he lost regarding business fraud. And so I was like, oh, that's interesting. Who else might have allegations of fraud and corruption? Yeah.
Do you insert in all these data points yourself?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, well, first of all, I've never seen anything like this. But the fact that you went into like dozens of people and did research on them, that's wild.
Yeah. And so I was like, what else is going on here? And so I made filters. So like, this is allegations / charges of fraud or corruption. And like a lot of companies and people associated with them are involved here. Like Hunt Consolidated, which is the flagship company of one of the richest families in Dallas, the Hunts. You can also see like all of the families that are billionaires and their companies. And then also this other organization called the Dallas Citizens Council, which I think you know about, Brandi. But these are all the people that are affiliated with the Dallas Citizens Council and like their various businesses and stuff. So it was a really interesting project to learn that like the people who are trying to be friends with the police also happen to be, in some instances, white collar criminals. And I found that to be deliciously ironic, but difficult to describe to people without sounding kind of insane. And so I thought this would be maybe a more in-depth way for them to understand exactly what I was talking about. And this is becoming more and more common, sort of like interactive data journalism that accompanies long form journalism. And if you can build that skill while you're in college, that would make you very, very competitive for some pretty cool jobs at some cool organizations.
So how long did that take you?
I had a little help with it. I had a friend who was helping me do some of the research, and then I mean, it didn't take me like more than a few days of like hard work. I don't know exactly how many hours, but it wasn't like months and months and months of undertaking. Like you can do some of this stuff surprisingly quick if you just know how to do it properly.
Gotcha. Eddie, do you have a question for Steven? Eddie wants to do broadcasts for Telemundo, so I have no doubt that he will have plenty of things that he could cover as a broadcast journalist for Telemundo.
I've only been on television twice, so I don't really know a ton about that, but I know that broadcast journalism is important and it has a whole different set of skills that go into it that I don't know about.
So you were on CNN, right?
Yeah, after I infiltrated a QAnon conference in Dallas.
Yeah. Kaylee, do you have a question? Kaylee's in sports and wants to continue sports, right?
Yeah. I was gonna say investigative is definitely not my thing, and I feel like it's probably where I'm weakest at. So do you have any advice on like how to like make my writing better? Like kind of like what Malone asked, like kind of how to find your beat in investigative.
Right. So, this is just personal experience, but finding something you care about, I think, is important, because if you're doing investigative work, a part of it is inherently about sort of unearthing something bad, kind of, and trying to affect some change. And to do that work, you want to be, I think, frankly, kind of motivated. And so it's almost, I might be even breaking some of the, sacred rules of some journalism schools by saying like, you should have a point of view or care about it. if you're going to write about it. But I think when it comes to investigation, like you should have a sense of moral compass. You should believe something is right or wrong. Like if you're going to report on like a case of domestic abuse, it's probably helpful to believe that domestic abuse is bad and wrong and something to sort of be exposed and brought to justice. And so reading stuff has helped me, just reading about things, as many as you can that pique your interest. And so if you're in sports, if you're trying to do sports journalism, maybe try to find some historical landmark articles that were investigative in nature as they related to sports, like the doping scandals, for example. Those are pretty landmark investigative stories that had impacts within the realm of sports. And so, that's not something that I think I could write well about, because it's not that I hate sports or dislike them, but it's just not my passion, like some other people. So I hope that's helpful. I wish I could tell you what my magic sauce was for deciding to write about extremism. But it was just basically kind of noticing that it was around and other people weren't writing about it. And it is something that I care about because I like living in a democracy, just like personally, and I'm not afraid to say that. And so if there are people who are trying to like do not democracy, I feel motivated to write about it. And so it becomes easy for me to sort of, do the work necessary to be successful.
Well, I feel like it probably was easier to start as a freelancer anyway, because like the Dallas Morning News, for instance, isn't really covering that at the same level because they're afraid, right? They're going to have to lose their subscription base. Rather, you build your network from covering extremism. You get what I'm saying? So
yes, that is true. One of the downsides I've heard from people who work as staff journalists who are trying to do more investigative work on certain issues is that they have to convince, sort of a whole totem pole of people who have decision-making power in order to get the sign off to do it. So, if you have the ability to look into things in your free time, or if you're able to try to do freelance and you can have some sort of cushion or support to do that, it may be a feasible route for you. Otherwise, you kind of have to be an expert in your field, and you have to be sort of that's why sort of a lot of big scoops are put out by these like senior investigative reporters who have extensive and deep networks of sources that it just takes, time to develop.
absolutely. Ariana, do you have a question? Well, Ariana is retiring after college. She doesn't want to work. So.
Look, I'm also trying to retire, so I get it.
Y'all don't remember her very well saying to Vikram that she did not want the job.
Okay, that's not just like I want to quit journalism. That's just I don't want to work.
No, that's what I don't want to do. I don't want to do anything either. But Brianna is doing great work, producing really great work for the student newspaper. And she was brave enough to do an article on whether or not the Guns Up slogan should be replaced with increasing rates of gun violence. And she is now telling me that someone told her to kill herself as a result. So she's learning early. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Oh, lovely. Yeah, I'm familiar with that territory, except it's like that's just like the dumbest reason for someone to threaten you with a death threat. Like, God, I'm sorry.
They were like, I should get a gun and shoot you with it. And I was like,
What?
no, that's fine.
No, yeah, I've gotten plenty of threats. Steven gets literally physically assaulted every time he goes out in public. So
That's not true. That's only happened like one time. Okay,
Okay.
two times, and one of the times was the cops. So like, for what it's worth.
Oh, was like shoving you with his wife there.
I have a question.
Yeah, it is what it is. I mean, I have to do my best to be a good boy. And and not get arrested again, even if I would be within my rights in terms of self-defense. It's like for the best to just like be a neutral observer as much as possible.
What is your question?
My question, so whenever you're freelancing and you turn stuff into the editor or whoever, like if they did it, what do you do?
Great question. It depends on the editor. I find it's important to just develop trust with editors. And a good editor, in my experience, will do the following. So they will have a conversation with you. You'll, email them a pitch. They'll say, okay, let's talk. You kind of iron out a few details, and then you say, okay, cool. And then you send them a Google Doc of your draft. This is what I do. And then I expect them to make changes in the Google draft in a way that I can see what those changes are, whether it suggests changes if they want to do that, or if they want to do like bold changes or like whatever. But a good editor will make that first pass and then, get back to you. And depending on how much editing they did or like how many thoughts they have, it could just basically be copy edits, or it could be like structural changes or requests for more information. And then they'll say, okay, take a look at this. And it's up to you to get back to it whenever you can. I try to do it as quickly as possible, just because that means I get paid faster. And then, usually it should only take 1 or 2 rounds of that at max, because otherwise that means like maybe you just don't have a good sense of what this editor's style is. Because ideally as a freelancer, I aim to try to have as limited interaction on that front as possible. Like I want what I send to be light touch so that it just gets done and that I don't have to keep spending more time than I already initially planned on spending on writing an article. So like the first time you work with an editor, you should expect to work more, and then over time hopefully get that down. And then a good publication after that initial edit will then send it to a copy editor, and their responsibility is not anything structural. All they will ever be doing is just making sure that it's like AP standard or Chicago style, whatever they use. And then that's it. And as a freelancer, you should know your rights. So like they technically can't tell you how to do your job. They can like ask you, like you can make an agreement around like, yeah, I'm gonna like do my basic job. I'm gonna interview enough sources, and then I'm gonna report the facts and take notes. But beyond that, like, unless you agree to it, they can't really say, can you go back out tomorrow and do like a whole other day's work on this? That's when you can usually say, okay, but you should pay me more money for that. Because that's not what we agreed to. And so, a good editor will do all those things and be transparent. I've worked with bad editors in the past, and they just like make changes and publish it, and that's not cool. So I don't work with them anymore. It's ultimately up to you as a freelancer to decide what your boundaries are and what you're comfortable with. So, know yourself. First step.
Could you send a example in addition to a pitch of a FOIA request that has been answered, so they can also,
Yeah, I can.
Perfect.
Yeah, and like knowing the law, like the basics around that stuff is super important so that you can call people on their bullshit. Especially if you're a freelancer, you may not always have a lawyer who can do stuff for you on call. And if you do, that means you might be in trouble. So, or you're just super successful and good for you. I certainly don't have a lawyer on call all the time who can just like bully people for me when I know that I'm correct. But newspapers do. And so, FOIA requests can get a little tricky if they try to string you along and you don't have any other form of recourse. So like doing some research around free legal resources, also super helpful. I've used them and they work.
Yes, I think the Committee to Protect Journalists and the SPJ should also supply flyers when it comes down to it. So, yes.
Yeah.
I think those are all the questions for my students. I really
Cool.
appreciate you for talking with us today. I am not an investigative journalist, so I would have never been able to speak on this in the same way that you could. So I appreciate it so much.
Yeah, of course. And, I would encourage you, if you guys do have interest in this stuff, just to like, look up, use Google, learn how to use Google. First off, if you don't feel good about using Google, learn how to do it really well. That is like the way you can find things. And then after that, go look at some of the resources available on some of the centers for investigative journalism that are out there. There's an abundance of resources. I would encourage you to use them. They've helped me so much so that, yeah, as Brandi said, I don't have a degree in this. Some people might believe I do, and they'll be like, you went to Northwestern? And I was like, yeah, sure, but I didn't go to Medill. So whatever. You guys do have the privilege of being able to learn from people like Brandi, who cut their teeth and, know a lot of other stuff that I don't know. So, enjoy it. You're in good hands. And I hope this wasn't a waste of an hour of your time, because, sometimes class can be. So thanks for listening to me. And I hope it's a decent day out there in Lubbock.
Yes, thank you. Sorry you couldn't come up here.
Oh no, I couldn't come to Lubbock.
There is the plan though. That was the original plan.
I'm joking. I've never been. I can't talk shit. I've like literally never been. So yeah, no, I'll come some other time. I do need to get on a road trip and get out of the city. Thank you for having me, Brandi.
Yes, absolutely. You have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.